Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And last episode, we left ourselves with a couple of branching topics to talk about. We talked a bit about adaptation in video games and adapting franchises, whether movies, books, TV shows, anything, even other video games, into new games. And we, at the very end, touched on the franchise of Star Wars. And as of when this podcast posts, the week after, a new Star Wars movie comes out, The Last Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
And Star Wars itself has had an interesting adaptation canon history. So I kind of wanted to dedicate an episode to talking about Star Wars, especially because I love Star Wars so much.
Same. I think also the logic is just like on a music podcast, you can't talk about the Beatles with something else or Queen with something else. You kind of have to devote time to just that one band because they're just so influential in the space. For sure, Star Wars has that kind of weight in pretty much all medium, especially gaming. I mean, considering the fact that this is a franchise we're not bothering to explain, because honestly, if you don't know what Star Wars is, then why are you listening to this episode? Star Wars will be somewhere in the title. And the reality is, even people who don't watch Star Wars know who Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader are, for the most part.
Yeah, Star Wars is definitely a huge subject of pop culture osmosis. You know lines from it, you know bits from it, you understand some of the controversies about it. Now, granted, I grew up in a Star Wars family, so I also am I have a bit of myopia about, well, of course everybody knows that, Han shot first. Like, we know what that means, right?
Right.
But no, I mean, certainly enough, no, I am your father, and you recognize Darth Vader, and you know what a lightsaber sounds like. These things are ever present. I mean, not the least of which, those sorts of things will show up in games outside of Star Wars. The amounts of times that you will give characters a glowing, humming energy blade as
We're looking at you, Halo.
And I mean, to be fair, Halo did a pretty decent job of at least giving it its own shape, its own idea.
Sure,
but
of course.
Yeah, so many times.
Well, yeah, it's like every time I saw the Omni tool in Mass Effect, like, I know it's not a lightsaber, but it's kind of a lightsaber.
Yeah, and it definitely has a bit of a nod, and it draws from the art and aesthetics of Star Wars.
For sure.
And certainly more than anything else, the aesthetics of Star Wars have had a great influence on a lot of sci-fi design in films, in books, in games. It's not the only one, I know that, but it certainly is a big one.
Well, sure. I mean, the earliest Star Wars game I remember playing, I didn't own it, a friend had it, but it was, of course, Super Star Wars, which came out for the Super Nintendo, and it came out around the time... It didn't come out around the time of Star Wars, but I think it came out around the time of one of the anniversaries or something.
I think so.
They put it on Super Nintendo, and of course, they actually had the full trilogy, Super Star Wars, Super Empire Strikes Back, and Super Return of the Jedi, all for the Super Nintendo. And all I remember about that, the Super Star Wars game, is running around on the first stage on Tatooine as Luke with a blaster pistol, trying to, I think, break into the Jawa ship or jumping around on the Jawa ship, something like that.
Yeah, I definitely remember playing Super Return of the Jedi a bunch and being old enough to snark about the fact that, man, I don't remember that orb that was the doorkeeper for Jabba's palace being so large or being dangerous enough to be a video game boss, but
Right.
Here we are. I'm having a great time.
Right, yeah. Well, and what was interesting about Super Star Wars as a franchise was the fact that it was what we talked about with a lot of other adaptations. It took the aesthetic, the look, and the characters from Star Wars, but then otherwise just made a platformer, which,
Yes.
we discussed at length with the first Batman game for Nintendo, did a similar thing. And honestly, as a kid, like, that's all I kind of really needed.
I agree. It was I would say the Super Star Wars trilogy, the Super NES adaptations, out of the ones I've played, was the most completely non-adherent to the ideas of Star Wars, but they got the look right, they captured the characters, they had so many other pieces of it, but it was the least, believably in-universe experience.
Right.
And Star Wars is definitely one that it has a universe, an implied one, a built one, And it's always very funny to think nowadays about Star Wars as a franchise versus when, like Matt, say you and I were kids. Because when we were kids, Star Wars was a beloved franchise that had 3 movies, and the the final film had come out certainly years before I was born and a little before you were, I believe, like not much.
Yeah.
And then there was 20 years of no new releases of like official canon quality. There were novels being written when we were kids that were sort of like, yeah, sure, that's the extended universe, cool. But they were still making these adaptations. They were still creating new video games with all of this without new movies coming out. These were movie tie-ins 15, 20 years after any new film in the franchise had come out.
Sure. And like, I also remember, and I think this may have come out after the newer films, but the Star Wars Trilogy Arcade, where each movie was a different kind of, not necessarily mini game, but a different genre of game. Like you had the lightsaber duel with Darth Vader, kind of a la Punch Out. At the end of the game, you had a snowspeeder mission where you were driving the snowspeeder. You had a X-wing battle over the Death Star, and I think you blow up the Death Star. So like all of those things were featured in this kind of chopped up mashup Star Wars game, which got a lot of positive reviews. I remember kids loving to play that.
I sure did.
But I also remember, so for me, my experience with the extended universe didn't come along until the N64. For me, when Shadows of the Empire came out for the N64, is like, oh, a new Star Wars character, a new game. And then I found out it was based on a book, and I read the book, and then I played the game. And I remember when I was a kid, it was probably one of the first Star Wars games I ever bought with my own money for a console. I'd had some PC games, and we'll get to those. But like, I remember bringing that game home, and that first stage where you're walking around as Dash Rendar, and you're like shooting wampas and avoiding snowtroopers and all of that. It was really cool. I remember loving it. However, I went back to it, let's say maybe 5 years ago. A friend had an N64. It did not age well with one analog stick. The controls are awful. The graphics are awful. I think I loved it because I wanted to love it, which we do with franchise stuff sometimes, but it didn't age well. But I remember at the time it being like this huge revelation in gaming, especially Star Wars stuff.
Oh yeah, no, and you're right. It kind of was the first like big medium release. Because there was no Shadows of the Empire movie, but it was sort of like the story between Empire and Return of the Jedi, and so this book's coming out, and they released toys based around it. Like you could get Prince Shizor's Virago ship. I remember they had that.
Yep.
Like all of those things, and they did sell the Outrider and all that. And yes, we can very much say nowadays that Dash Rendar was just Han Solo with the serial numbers filed off, but still loved him anyway.
Yeah.
And that was probably the first, I guess like official-ish Star Wars release I could think of, like as far as new story, new everything else. Because I'm sure I would need more than both my hands to count the amount of times the Death Star run has been rendered into a video game, or the amount of times that we've had to knock over an AT-AT walker or anything like that.
Sure.
So,
well, yeah, like the original Star Wars arcade game was literally a rotoscope, a la Tron.
The vector graphics,
vector graphics, rather, yeah. And like that was like the first Star Wars game, and like the TIE fighters were these just little plus signs pretty much on the screen, and like it was revolutionary for the time. I think that got a Atari release also, maybe. But like, and I remember like on console there were these other games that were coming out, but it wasn't until the second trilogy, the prequel trilogy, came out that there was like this influx of Star Wars games, because it was franchises were marketed differently by that point, whereas on the PC, you had all of the Jedi Academy games, X-Wing and TIE Fighter, and all of these great flight sims. PC approached Star Wars very differently. The experience was much about being a pilot and being in ships and simulator experiences. And then even with like Jedi Knight and Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast were both about simulating a battle and a lifestyle as a Jedi. It wasn't until much later when we got games that kind of broke away from that. But in the early years of the PC gaming market, it was all to replicate a lifestyle within the Star Wars universe.
And I think that kind of really hits a nail on it. A lot of the adaptations, like we were talking a lot about Batman last episode, and the idea of like feeling like what it is to be Batman.
Right.
Because you experience Batman comics, Batman movies, you're like, I want to be Batman. You experience Star Wars. Okay, yes, most of us want to be Jedi. That sounds so cool.
Right.
But also, a lot of people want to be X-Wing pilots. A lot of people want to be smugglers. A lot of people want, that you see so many like cool things that you're like, I want to do that. And something that Star Wars did very well, and many other franchises have, but we're talking about Star Wars here, is fill every little gap they can think of for information. You go to Wikipedia, the Star Wars wiki, and if a character appeared on screen for a frame, they weren't even the focus of, but they were there. Nowadays, they have been given a name. They have a backstory. They have a planet of origin. That the amount of information about every little thing that can be found. Harry Potter's got nothing on this.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah, and you can explore a lot of those different avenues. And I feel a lot of the more successful, really good Star Wars games did those off the beaten path. Not your Luke Skywalker, but your, such and such character we made up who is part of this world.
Sure. And I'm jumping ahead a bit. Like, for me, I think Star Wars and the creative capacity to live in that world hit its peak for me in the modern games, because I started to be more drawn towards games that created new narratives that were further apart from previous stuff. And so, like, for me, that's the Old Republic series, Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, and of course, the Old Republic, the MMO that BioWare released as well. Say what you want about the Old Republic. I played it on and off. I really liked it for a while, and then I stopped. The single player storyline experience was mastercraft. It was brilliantly written, fully voice acted. You really felt like you were a member of this world. The end game rating and all of that stuff, that's more of an MMO problem, wasn't really as great. But if you want a great story from beginning to end, playing any of those classes really gave you a unique experience with some overlap with other classes. But for the most part, the class-specific quest was a whole narrative on its own that allowed you to engage with stuff that happened in Knights of the Old Republic, meet characters from that, go to locations from that. And I thought that was really cool.
Nice. Is that MMO still running right now?
It is. It's free to play, which I don't mind. I have a bunch of veteran tokens because I got it at launch, and I got the special edition at launch, and so I can go back and play every so often. But yeah, if you've never played it, it's free to play to create an account and start playing. Of course, it's got the freemium locks, like that doesn't allow you to do certain things, which we're not getting into this week. But
that'll be next time,
right? But it's worth trying because the graphics are phenomenal. The soundtrack is John Williams. It's all phenomenal. And, it's got a great narrative. So I do recommend it for that, especially now that it's free to play. But also games like The Force Unleashed, and not so much The Force Unleashed 2, but Force Unleashed 1. Like, first of all, I love the actor who was scanned and played Starkiller, because I've seen him in a ton of other stuff, and he was great as Starkiller. And that first game just was really compelling. And it was in a wholly original story. I think they wrote the book after they did a book adaptation, but it started as a game. And the second one is notoriously panned, and I didn't really love it either, but the first one gave you access to force powers unlike you've had in any other game, and it was really neat.
Well, it was one of those times you really got to be a dark Jedi and have a heroic story, but you still Kyle Katarn, okay, yeah, you could get some dark side powers, but things will go horribly awry. No, you are Darth Vader's apprentice.
Yeah.
Here's the dark side. Have fun.
Pretty much, yeah. And it was well written. It was well acted. It was really good. I thought the ending left something to be desired. Because there was a non-canon and a canon ending, and then with So spoiler alert: if you haven't played this game, that's probably a decade old now. Starkiller in the canon ending dies. He sacrifices himself to save the rebels so they can continue on to create the rebellion. But then in the sequel, it turned out he wasn't dead, but maybe you were a clone of the original. And I never finished the second one to actually figure out what that story was. So it started with something that was really great, and then got kind of convoluted. And that's something that I find happens with adaptations more than other games. When you have an original IP and it goes off the deep end, usually it's after the 7th or 8th game where it's gone on too long. But I feel things that are tied to franchises, people are more critical of, and therefore it's easier to kind of jump the shark.
I agree. And there is such a wide timeline for Star Wars that I think people can get away with honestly doing self-contained stories, and you're probably better off that way.
Yeah.
Having a beginning, middle, end, and letting The Force Unleashed be its own thing. And unfortunately, these are video games, and this is Star Wars, and this is all sorts of stuff. This is franchise. So it's, well, this worked. Let's draw blood from this stone until we can't, and then make another one.
Right. Well, and also that has to do with the publishers a little bit, because if they're willing to shell out the cash to make those things happen, they happen. There's something that's interesting about Star Wars that I don't want to get into the trenches of, because I'm not someone who paid that much attention to the extended universe. But considering a lot of these video games were considered part of the extended universe, which now has been rendered non-canon essentially by the new movies that are coming out.
Yes, Star Wars Legends.
It's interesting to me. Like, I've not seen any other franchise do that with authority, say, all that stuff, all of this extra media, not canon. Now, for like something like the Harry Potter series, they've more or less been replicating the books and the movies.
Yeah.
They've not been creating wholly original stories. All of those have been canon. Especially like the new Broadway play, Cursed Child, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
has the signature of J.K. Rowling. Same thing for like Lord of the Rings. All of the games that have come out have gotten approval from the Tolkien estate that these are canon stories within the timeline.
Well, I think the difference there is those can have a singular signature to them.
Yeah.
Harry Potter as a franchise comes back to Rowling. The Tolkien estate is Lord of the Rings, and especially since Tolkien wrote a lot more than just The Hobbit and the trilogy.
Yeah.
There was all of those tales. There's the Silmarillion. There's everything else. While Star Wars can be traced back to George Lucas, there's a much bigger entity going on as far as canon goes. And certainly, if you want to get into the extended universe, and as somebody who grew up reading a lot of those books, there is so, like, who's my real daddy on as far as like the creator and arbiter of what is canon in all of this. It's as difficult as really talking about like comic book characters and going like, all right, who's the one person that signs off on this? Well, it's a corporation.
Yeah.
Oh, that gets complicated.
Well, sure. Well, especially now with Disney owning both Star Wars and Marvel, like Marvel has always had its cinematic universe. And so everything that's canon to the movies are just canon to the movies, with the exception of like TV shows and some of the other stuff. But that live action universe is all one universe. There's already this agreement that any games and all this other stuff, unless directly tied to it, are their own space. Whereas Star Wars has aggressively said nothing but the movies is canon. It just feels weird to me. I mean, essentially, yes,
you're right.
You can still read the books, you can still play the games, and you can still decide what you want to be considered canon. But it just seems like a strange move to decide that these games that have existed almost as long as the series has, now they don't count. Like, so that means Shadows of the Empire, for example, doesn't count.
Doesn't count. Knights of the Old Republic doesn't count. Force Unleashed doesn't count. Jedi Power Battles. Well, that really shouldn't count anyway.
That's true. But yeah, it's strange to me. And of course, like, I guess the ones based on the movies, like Pod Racer, will be considered canon because it's based on the movie.
It's canon-ish, yeah.
It's just interesting to me as a franchise that they've done that. That means that the comic books aren't canon, the books aren't canon.
The decades of merchandising storytelling has been rendered moot.
Yeah, except for anything animated, anything live action, like all of that is still considered canon. Anything that was in a visual medium, and it just seems odd to me. It's a bummer. But that's the direction they wanted to go, and so they did. But that said, they've still been consistently making really interesting and fun games. I mean, we haven't talked, about the elephant in the room yet, which is the Battlefront series. And
Yes.
there were 3 of the first generation of Battlefront, right? Or was it 2?
I want to definitely 2. I'm trying to remember if there's a
I
third.
can't remember if there's a third. But anyway, like those games were a lot of fun. They took the Call of Duty style shooter, introduced the Star Wars stormtroopers and rebel forces, and allowed you to gain control of powerful main storyline characters in these battles when you got certain perks, got enough kills, whatever the requirement was. The series was very popular and then ended, I think, because the studio that was originally doing it went under.
Yeah, I think so.
And then when did the last one come out? A couple of years ago, they made a
like
new
3 years ago?
Battlefront for PS4 and Xbox One. And it was sort of well received. It was only multiplayer. There was like single player, like essentially horde modes you could do, or multiplayer horde modes, and then training missions. But that was really it. But people loved it because the mechanics were really solid and still felt like a Star Wars game where you could unlock these characters and play as them. I, for one, bought it towards the end of its life cycle, and I liked it, but most of my friends had moved on, so I didn't really have a lot of friends to play it with. I played with randos, and that was okay. But, and then we talked about they just released Battlefront 2, which is, boasted having this 5 to 10 hour campaign and multiplayer and other stuff. But of course, it had that issue with the loot boxes. Now, I haven't played the new one yet. I know the people who have played it have loved the story mode. They thought it was very well done. But it seems like they really hurt their sales early on by this controversy, as it were.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's very nice that in one way they listened and heeded what was wrong with the first Battlefront they did, and gave a more robust single-player experience. And it's like, okay, if you buy this, a year later, you're still going to get a good game out of it.
Right.
But, then the whole loot box problem, I mean, I definitely tiraded about it last episode, and will continue to. And there's more than just the Star Wars games that we're running into this crap. Shadows of Mordor as well has been heavily under fire for this. And it is a very unfortunate thing. And it kind of lends itself towards an argument a lot of people have been having about Star Wars since Disney has taken over, which is to say that it's a little bit of bleeding us dry in rendering old Star Wars extended universe stuff non-canon. That means they are free to tell whatever stories they want and release films every year.
Right.
Now, look, I liked The Force Awakens. I loved Rogue One.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about The Last Jedi. And so that's all well and good. But it's that kind of thing of a lot of little half pains, little paper cuts. They're all going to add up, and it just turns your whole thing into a cactus.
Yeah, I think that the problem we're going to run into as things are deemed non-canon is people getting frustrated and not being able to get something new because it won't matter to Star Wars as a whole. Now, when you're dealing with stuff like the Old Republic, that was in the far past before any of the movies happened. So technically them deeming that non-canon is irrelevant because the Skywalker lineage doesn't exist in those games.
Yeah, it's a long time ago from a long time ago.
But, now we're never going to get another game like Force Awakens or that untitled Bounty Hunter game that they were working on that got canceled.
Right.
Because these are original stories being told in a universe that already exists, but no one's going to... If you're a writer and you're inspired by Star Wars and you want to write a game storyline, why would you do that if it'll be deemed non-canon by the official franchise? Like, it's not going to discourage, writers are still free to write about Star Wars, but I guarantee the number of books that come out about Star Wars are going to dwindle because people are just going to not go, wow, I can grow up and someday write for something that's going to be part of this lineage, but it's not the case anymore.
Yeah, and there was a agreement when the out of canon, I suppose, or the first of the Legends novels came out, that it was kind of a Lucasfilm going, all right, you can write these books, but everybody's got to kind of agree, so we don't like confuse the hell out of everybody. When Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire came out, and it was a watershed kind of trilogy as far as story goes, and it set so many standards, and people adhered to them, for better or for worse. There were better writers or better stories, but that's just the nature of multiple writers on a franchise. And yeah, to have all of that swept away, I don't know if we're going to get that kind of feeling again, or if we do, it's going to take a little while. And it is interesting though now that we've got the new trilogy happening, the future trilogy. I can certainly see that they have, whether intentionally or not, they share some parallels with stuff from the now Legends canon, which is kind of neat in its way.
Sure.
And people are just the same as when the Phantom Menace came out, and everything, like every game, every release was all about the prequel trilogy because this was going to be the big one. This was going to be the huge thing. I mean, I drank so much Mountain Dew collecting those Phantom Menace character cans. Oh my God. But that's neither here nor there. I guess it is a little bit of a, oh well, because they are creating things around, 20 years in the future from the original trilogy. But then they do Rogue One, which takes place pretty much concurrent to The Force Awakens.
Yeah.
So I'm still not sure how I feel about this. Like I'm excited to see what more. I'm always excited for new Star Wars games because you know what? Battlefront, the original versions, got me to play a Call of Duty shooter because it was Star Wars.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah. No, and I hear that. I mean, as someone who was mostly just into the movies, I thought I'd be less affected by them, denouncing the canon. But I think the reality is we're also getting less direct adaptations. Like we were talking earlier about Super Star Wars and that trilogy. Mm-hmm. They were direct, more or less. They were considered direct adaptations of the movies that came before them.
Right.
But we've not gotten a Rogue One game. We've not gotten a Force Awakens game. And that, at least, I kind of like. I like that at least if they're going to engage in other medium, that they're trying to change it up. Like, you can play as Rey in the new Battlefront if you unlock her as one of those powered characters. But otherwise, you're not really playing... You're playing a storyline that's considered canon because it's got the seal of approval from Disney and LucasArts in the main story of Battlefront, but you're not creating
a new story.
Right. It's still sort of within the canon, but we're not going to get something like Force Awakens again, or Force Unleashed rather. But at least we're not getting a ripoff of Force Awakens where you're playing as Rey or Finn and like killing X amount of bad guys and then running in circles. Like they're not trying to do any of that kind of nonsense.
Right. And I actually am very curious to see what they'll do when the new trilogy concludes, because it's all well and good to make stuff based off of the original trilogy because we know how it ends. We know all of the twists, all of the whatever. So you're not going to tease a romance plot between Luke and Leia because we know how horrifying that would be.
Right.
And that sort of thing could happen jumping the gun for the prequel trilogy because, we meet young Anakin Skywalker. Goshes and gollies, what an earnest kid that is. He's going to go far. We know exactly how far he goes.
Right.
So you can also make conclusions like that. But this new Disney trilogy, it's untapped ground. We don't know which revelations are going to happen. And I'm certain that there's a little bit of trepidation, whether internal from game companies or even Disney being like, guys, there's a lot of things you shouldn't do. Wait for the story. So I wonder in 5 years, once the full trilogy's out, what will come of direct adaptations from the film's events.
Yeah,
we might get a few interesting ones. But I also don't know. We might follow the adventures of Poe. Like, see what he's been up to.
Right.
Who knows? But, I mean, again, I keep coming back to it. I'm very excited for The Last Jedi. And it was very funny. Like, I would say, one of the the big golden moments for video game Star Wars was the late 90s.
Yeah.
When Shadows of the Empire came out, when the prequel trilogies were coming out, and that was also PS1 era, N64, and so it was like, oh man, actual new canon Star Wars films. I remember buying Star Wars Insider magazine because, yes, I am really that much of a Star Wars nerd.
Right.
Like before those movies came out, just because I loved Star Wars so much, I played the Star Wars customizable card game, the one where you had to have a light side deck and a dark side deck.
Of course you did.
And oh yes, followed all of these things. And that was another instance where if anybody has been on screen for even a moment, an object has been on screen, possibly in the corner of a film, you now have a card for it.
Right.
Because they had to draw from everything that they could.
Right.
Without necessarily making up new things. And so, yeah, like when a new canon thing came out, that we had several foregone conclusions. We knew Obi-Wan was going to survive the prequel trilogy. We knew Yoda was going to be okay. We knew Anakin was going to make it.
Right.
We could do all kinds of things with that. And granted, when the prequel films came out and I would watch them opening night, I would make so many people mad at school by telling them that, like, oh man, I can't believe Obi-Wan died. And,
right. Because that can't
spoiling in quotes.
Right. Because you can't, well, yeah, like, when the prequels first came out, it's like, oh, I can't believe they killed Darth Vader. That was a bold move. It's like, obviously, he doesn't die. He's in the later movies. But yeah, no, it's the same thing for me with the new trilogy. And I think you're absolutely right about kind of waiting to see where it goes. But there is one prediction that I feel like I could almost be 100% in predicting the future of something that will happen once all three of the new trilogy movies are out.
Are they going to get remastered?
Probably, but where I was going with it is that Lego will probably release a Lego game.
And I'm going to love it.
Yeah. Here's the thing about the Star Wars Lego games, I think, that were really cute because they were kind of the first of the generation of these adaptations that we talked about, is that when they started with the newer trilogy because they came out during the newer trilogy. So,
that's right.
So we got those three first, and then they went back and did Lego Star Wars Classic, which was the original trilogy. Mm-hmm. And then I think we already got a Lego Force Awakens game. I believe that came
I think
out.
we did, yeah.
So they'll do one for The Last Jedi probably, and then when the third one comes out, they'll probably do one master collection with all three. And what I think the fun thing about the Star Wars Lego game versus the other is all of the Lego games has featured a mechanic that to get through the stages, you had to build Lego pieces. And what was always very cool is that the Force users would build it using the Force, which I thought was a neat mechanic. And I can almost see the pitch meeting where they're like, we want to do a Lego Star Wars game so you can use the Force to build stuff. And then everything else came later. Like, because it just seems like a great starting point because it's just so fun.
It's just the right kind of ridiculous. And also, again, I mean, Star Wars is a space opera. It's melodrama. There's humorous moments, but it's very much a, John Williams score, big, epic, whatever. And Lego can't help but poke fun, have tongue firmly in cheek.
Right.
And there's something wonderful about being able to play through those and to see all of these big moments with kind of like the air taken out of it a little bit. It doesn't. It doesn't hurt the originals in any way. It only, if anything, enriches your enjoyment of them.
Sure, yeah. Well, and also because back then they didn't do voiceover like they're doing now. They wouldn't take the audio from the movies. They would do pantomime, which none of the characters spoke, which also kind of added to the hilarity.
Yeah, especially because there were so many iconic moments that they could just act them out and you're hearing the voices, or they can start them and then completely subvert them and you knew what they were messing with.
Right. In
all those ways.
I always liked how tongue-in-cheek Lego was, and I don't think I mentioned this on the last episode. I remember when I got the Lego Lord of the Rings game, that was the first game where they used audio from the movie in the game, remastered, so they could have the dialogue. And in the scene where Boromir dies, spoiler alert, Boromir dies,
no.
When the Uruk-hai is shooting him with all the arrows, in the Lego version, he pulls out a chicken, he pulls out a fish, and he pulls out, whatever else. And all of those things are stuck in him as he falls over. And it's that kind of thing where they're going to still portray those serious moments, but they're going to make them a little goofier. Because at the end of the day, it's a kid's game.
Yes. Yes, it is.
And they want to make it fun and imaginative. And I loved that about the early, especially Lego Star Wars games, because also there's so many characters in Star Wars, and the fact that you could play through the game as Boba Fett or Greedo or Han Solo or Jabba the Hutt or whoever else, like having access, you could be several protocol droids, not just C-3PO, several R2 units, not just R2-D2.
And you can mix and match.
And you can mix and match. It was a very cool and clever idea that I think is one of the more beneficial things to come from adaptations of Star Wars properties.
Yeah, and I think also with Star Wars being as aesthetic of a series as it is, I'm thinking about other like Lego adaptations. And a lot of them, they can work with like very broad strokes, who's going on and what. But Star Wars, I feel it almost, and I'm making a bold step by making this statement. Mm-hmm. Star Wars has a lot in common with the Mario series because there are small things, whether colors chosen, lines, shapes, capes, helmets, whatever, that it shows up and it speaks volumes. And those things can pop up here or there, Something can be in the shape of C-3PO's head off in the distance, and you recognize it and you see it. Darth Vader's helmet is as iconic as a one-up mushroom, as far as shape, color, whatever else. The music, the John Williams score, people can hum so much Star Wars music, just the same way you can hum so much Mario music. And it can show up in little bits and pieces, even amongst original compositions, and it colors and tempers. There are the sounds of the lightsabers. There are the weapons used, the times, the timelines, the planets. And again, it's a large, sweeping franchise, big effing surprise, but it's one that has tried at varying times to be so wildly variant in what they show that when it's minimized, whether in vector graphics or Lego bricks or anything else, you recognize so much. And then when they like give you that little bit of fan service of like, and here's Darth Vader, you lose your mind.
Sure. And I think you're ultimately, I agree with, first of all, I do agree with that, but I think that also lends itself to Star Wars being kind of like the movie franchise. There are a few others like Star Trek and some other things, but like Star Wars started in the movies. And at the end of the day, it'll end in the movies. Like that's just where it's going to go and come from. And because of that strong backbone, it's able to stand tall in books and gaming and tabletop and board games and whatever else. And, there are tons of games that we haven't even mentioned, like Empire at War and,
any of the Rebel Assault games. Well, we did Jedi Knight, but Dark Force is the original.
Right. And then the fighting games like Masters of Terrakazi, which you mentioned, or like them crossing over into Soul Calibur and putting those characters in the Soul Calibur games. There's a versatility to the Star Wars franchise that allows them to pretty much go into any gaming genre and create solid content if effort is put in. Now, not every game is great. Republic Commando is an underrated game that a lot of people like. I never actually got to play, but like they've done first-person shooter, third-person shooter, MMO, regular RPG,
racing games, puzzle
games, fighting games. Like they've tried everything, and I think that's
point-and-click adventures.
Point-and-click adventures. That's right. I think that's what ultimately allows Star Wars to be a franchise with so much versatility, is because they've been around long enough to have done almost everything, and they continue to thrive because of that. And I think ultimately, even though we feel a little stiffed by the locking in of what is lore in the Star Wars universe, I think that there will be some semblance of a renaissance later on, like other franchises, that will have more canon official stuff that will come out within partnership with this new canon and with Disney. I think, even though it sounded a little bleak earlier that we won't get another Force Unleashed, I think that's kind of true. I think that there will be more people who will reach out to whoever these heads of the canon are to try and incorporate new things or find things they can add to still be able to create within that universe.
And I think because the film franchise now under Disney's helm is not doing just, here's the main trilogy, you guys do whatever the hell you want. They came out with Rogue One. They're coming out with the Han Solo movie. They are starting to fill in those gaps. So we'll
Right.
probably get more direct adaptations or more directly influenced adaptations, but we'll have a lot more material to directly adapt from. So we don't have to do the Death Star run another 12 times. Happily. But, if it's a new game, I'd rather have a new experience.
Right, of course. But needless to say, I also am excited about The Last Jedi. I'm excited to see where the story goes. I'm excited to see Rey become an even more badass Jedi.
I'm excited for all things. All things.
Right. So I think one thing to say about being excited for all of this is that, the franchise is still growing, and the original actors, for the most part, are in it. R.I.P. Carrie Fisher, who we will miss. But she's still in the new movie, and there's still this legend left by these actors. And so I'm always going to be excited to see where it goes and grows. But I'm curious what our audience, what their favorite Star Wars video game experience is, because there's just been so many. Because I don't even know if I have a favorite.
I was about to ask.
My favorite, I might be just my memory of Shadows of the Empire and the experience and the exhilaration I got from that game. Even though it doesn't really hold up now, it just felt kind of... Well, actually, you know what? I'll say that The Force Unleashed is my favorite Star Wars game. Probably because, A, I love the character of Starkiller. I love the characters he surrounded himself with. But also, and most importantly... It was just a fleshed out game with incredible mechanics. The level of control they gave you over lightsaber battling, force powers, interacting with the environments, puzzle solving, all of that stuff made it one of the best and most immersive Star Wars experiences.
I can agree with that. My favorite would probably be, and I did say this last episode, I think my favorite is probably X-Wing.
I mean, it's a great game.
It's a great game. It's the one I've got the most nostalgia for. I certainly played my fair share of TIE Fighter, but X-Wing was kind of I also really like the Rebels. And I also, there was a period of time where pretty much all of my computer games on my old Mac were LucasArts games. So we had X-Wing, and we had actually bought a point-and-click adventure pack. So and we'd ordered some other ones too. So I had Sam and Max Hit the Road, Day of the Tentacle, The Dig, Full Throttle, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. So that era of LucasArts games, I have such nostalgia and love for it. And I still have my copy of X-Wing. I wonder if I can get it to work on my new computer. I'd love to try it again. And that's one of the reasons I do love console games. So I don't have to worry about the updates. And I can go sit down and play Rebel Assault 2 or Dark Forces or, heaven forbid, Masters of Terraskazi right now.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I guess I do love the new games, and I may find a new favorite soon. But I'd say X-Wing is probably my classic favorite.
Well, I'm learning something now. I think that if we were trapped in the Star Wars universe, we would probably battle to the death, because I tend to lean towards the dark side. Bounty hunters and dark Jedis tend to be where my allegiance is.
I mean, I love me some good bounty hunters. Don't get me wrong. And who knows how I'd actually act in these instances? But
That's true.
Who do you want to be? I like the rebels.
Right. Yeah. Of course. Well, yeah. When everyone's a bright, shiny kid with no, dark side per se, it's like, yeah, the rebels, they're the good guys.
I also play paladin, so
that's fair. That's more telling, I think, than anything else we've said on this episode.
Fair enough.
But as always, guys, thanks for listening. Let us know what your Star Wars feels are, where you engage with them in the games, if you even engage in the games. There may be fans of the franchise who just stick to the movies and the books and haven't played any of the games. And if so, what would you be your starting point? Where would you jump in? There's definitely plenty of them out there. Someday I'll own a actual arcade cabinet of the Star Wars trilogy game, but it's very expensive.
Yes, it is.
But as always, thanks for listening. Please follow us on all the social media. Give us a like, comment on the site. Let us know your thoughts and feels in Star Wars land, please.
Absolutely. And enjoy The Last Jedi when it comes out. I know I will.
Yes, I cannot wait to see it.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody. Once again, I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.